tutorial, we're going to explore one of the more advanced features of Chordious, the diagram editor. As the name implies, the diagram editor lets you edit your diagrams, giving you full control to fine-tune the diagrams to look exactly the way you want. This tutorial assumes that you've already installed Chordious and played with some of the more basic features of the program. So if you haven't already, I'd recommend watching the earlier tutorial videos concerning installing Chordious and playing with the chord and scale finders. Otherwise, without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing to know about the diagram editor is that it can be invoked any place you see a diagram in Chordious. All you have to do is double-click on a diagram and you can start editing it. Now, for this video, we're going to go into the library and look at a collection of diagrams that I prepared in advance. So, I'm going to go to Diagram Editor Tutorial here. Here we have a couple diagrams that I've copied from a previous tutorial. And you can see I can select a diagram. In here, I can click on the Edit button here, this little pencil, to bring up the editor. I can also right-click and do Edit to edit the diagram. Or as I said before, I can double-click. So in this case, I'm just going to double-click on this diagram here. And here we have the diagram editor. So I'm going to go ahead and make it a little bit larger. Now I understand this is a very busy window. There's a lot of things on here. We're going to go through everything that's in this window one at a time so that you don't get overwhelmed. The first thing to look at is obviously we have a preview here of what the diagram is going to look like. Right? So as we make changes to the style of the diagram, you'll see those changes reflected here in the preview window. And then if you look down at the very bottom here, you can see this diagram doesn't have a background. It's actually transparent, which is why you see this checkerboard pattern back here. But if you that's hard to look at, you can change the background here to say white. So even though the diagram itself will still be transparent, you can change it just in the editor. You can change the background to white if that's your preference. I prefer seeing those checkerboard to remind me of what the diagram is transparent, so I'm going to leave the transparent checkerboard as the background. Now you'll see that on the left and right sides of the window, we have a whole list of options of things you can change with how this diagram looks. And each set of options are kind of logically grouped together into these little group boxes, right, with different names. We have layout, background, border, grid spacing, margins, etc. So we're going to go through each of these one by one, and we'll see in real time how changing them affects the look of this diagram here. So to get started, we're going to start with this very simple set of options up here. We have dimensions. So at the top here, we have width and height in pixels, and that's how big this diagram is. And you can see that you can't actually change this value here. If you want to change the size of the diagram, you're actually going to have to change some of the sizes of the things inside the diagram. The diagram will automatically resize. So these values are read-only, but it just lets you know how big the final diagram is going to look. The next two options are pretty straightforward. We have the number of frets and the number of strings. As you can see, this particular diagram has 4 strings and it has 4 frets. And by changing this number here, I can add or remove my own frets and strings for this particular diagram. So if I change the frets to 5, click down here, like, look, you'll see that now we have 5 frets in this diagram. If I wanted to, I could change it to 10. And now I have 10 frets in this diagram. Same thing with the number of strings. I can put 6 here, and it'll automatically add 2 more strings. But I'm going to go ahead and set these back to where they were before, because we're dealing with this ukulele fretboard, and I want to set it back to 4 frets and 4 strings. Okay, so that's different dimensions. That's really basic, being able just to resize if you have the wrong size diagram and you want to make it a different size. The next set of options here is diagram layout. And the first option we have is orientation. And you can see the orientation, the value is set to vertical. And you can see, yes, this is in fact a vertically aligned, a vertically oriented diagram. Let's say I want to change this to a horizontal diagram. Well, how do I do that? if I try to click on here, you'll notice that I can't actually change the orientation. It's stuck on vertical. So the way Chordious works is there's a built-in style that defines how this diagram looks. Everything from the font size to the spacing, everything about this has a default style that's built into the program. And you can see all these values for all these different settings. They're all grayed out, but those are the default styles that come with the program. If you want to change the style of a particular diagram, you have to override that default style. And you do that by clicking any of these little checkboxes to the left of each option. So in this case, if I want to change and override the style to be horizontal, I click on orientation here, and you'll see that enables the ability to change the orientation. And now, if I go ahead and click horizontal, you'll see now I've converted this diagram into a horizontal diagram. It's important to note that Chordious is just saving the information about the diagrams here. It's not saving actual pictures, so there's no loss in quality when you make any of these changes. So you can see we have a horizontal diagram, and all the text is still correctly written. It doesn't rotate everything to 90 degrees because that wouldn't be very useful. So here we have a horizontal diagram. And if you wanted to, if that's all I wanted to do was change that, all I have to do is hit OK. And going back into the diagram library, look, there's my diagram. It has now been changed to be a horizontal diagram. Well, I'm going to go back into the editor, make this big again. Now, let's say I don't want it to be horizontal. I want to keep it vertical. I have two options. One, obviously, I could change this back to vertical, and now it's vertical again. Because I've overridden the style here, what that means is if that default style ever changed, it doesn't matter. I'm saying for this particular diagram, I'm saving, override that style, always make it vertical. This will become more important later in another video when I talk about how to change the default style so you can change how all of your diagrams look at the same time. But for right now, just assume that if you want to change something in an individual diagram at any point, if a diagram just doesn't look right and you want to change something, you can go into the diagram editor and check a box and change what that diagram looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and uncheck this. So now it's back to vertical because it's inheriting the default style vertical. Okay, let's go through some of the other options. This next one here, label model, is not something that most people are going to want to change. By default, Chordious makes sure that there's enough spacing around all of the labels, all of these little text labels, the title label, these labels underneath at the bottom of each string, and even labels that may appear on the right or left side of the fretboard. Chordious adds the padding to make sure everything looks nice. If you check this, you'll see there are different options for changing where padding is allowed. So for example, if I go to overlay, where there's no padding added, you'll see that some things start to get cropped off. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, let's say you didn't actually have a title at the top of every diagram, and you wanted to make sure that the padding, every diagram was exactly the same size, regardless of what you put, whether you added text or labels or not. It's kind of an advanced thing, not something that most people are going to want to deal with. But there are a few cases where you may have a set of diagrams that you aren't aligning properly, and you want them all to be the same size, and you can remove some of that padding if you want to. But for right now, we're just going to uncheck that and leave it the way it is, because this is the default, and the default works really well. Okay, the next set of options here, pretty straightforward. We have the diagram background. Now, of course, right now, the default you can see is a white background, but the opacity is at 0%, hence the reason why we have this transparency here. If I wanted to, let's say I had checked opacity here, and let's say I made it 100%. Oh, I unchecked it. I'll try that again. Now at 100%, it's completely covered up that transparent background. Or if I set it at 50%, you'll see it's only 50% opacity covering it up. So if I uncheck this, it goes back to 0, and you'll see that the checkerboard pattern becomes more prominent again. Okay, so I can change the color as well. So let's say I wanted the background to be purple. You can also type in any hexadecimal color values if you happen to know a specific color that you want to put in. But let me just set it to purple, and I'll set the opacity to 100. And now we have a nice solid 100% purple background. But like I said, you could also type in, if you have hexadecimal values, you could type in something like that. So that's red, green, blue, if you're familiar with doing hexadecimal colors, say in web design. If I click over here, so it's going to be 0 red, 100% green, 0 blue, and if I click on that, now you'll see I've changed the background to this neon green. Okay, so this is how you change the diagram background. Well, let's leave it, let's go ahead and leave it like this, and let's move on to the next section. So the next section here we have the diagram border. So as you can see, the border of the diagram, we have a 0 thickness diagram. So if I go ahead and click this here and say make it 5, you'll see now I've added a border around the entire diagram. It's 5 pixels wide and the color is black. Again, I can change this to any color, and you'll see that Chordious also remembers that I used that color before. So any of these built-in colors or any color that you want. So let's say I pick, I don't know, navy. It's kind of hard to see, but let me do 10 pixels wide. There you go. You get a nice navy blue border if that's what I wanted. Okay. The next option here is grid spacings. So this represents the spacing. So you have the fret spacing, which is the space between frets in pixels, and you have string spacing, the spacing between the strings here in pixels. So we have the default. As you can see, we have 30 and 37, so it's not exactly a square. But if you wanted to, I wanted to increase this, if I set it to 60, so twice as big, you'll see now I've increased the spacing between the frets. You'll also see at the top here, the height has increased because obviously the diagram is now larger. So this is how, if you don't like the exact spacing, you can fine tune and find the exact spacing that you want in between the strings and the diagrams to make the chord or the diagram shape exactly what you want, right? It's all about personal preference and how you want your diagrams to look. Similarly, same thing with the string spacing here. If I did something like 25, everything got a little bit more narrow. And you can see that it automatically recalculated the width and the height. Okay? So, let's just leave it like that at the moment. Another option, the next set of options we have here are the grid margins. This is the amount of space in between the grid, the actual grid here in the center, and the diagram itself. So right now you can see that the default values are all 30. So you can see that there's 30 pixels here on all sides. And then of course there's more spacing because of the labels. So if I click this, I can change all of the spacings at once. So if I say 60, you'll see I've now increased the margins and added some more spacing around the diagram. So the base lets you change the default for all of them. Left, and if you don't override the left, right, top, or bottom, it's going to use the base. But for example, you could pick left, and you could say, well, I want that to be only 20, let's say. And you'll see now I've changed the left side only. So similarly, you can change the margin on the right, the margin on the top, and the margin on the bottom. So if something is getting cut off, or for whatever reason you want to change the margins, you can do that here. Well, I'm going to go ahead and turn all these. I'm going to turn this off at least. Okay. So the same can be done for all the other margins. The next section we're going to talk about is the grid background. So the diagram background represented the entire diagram here. You can see the grid has its own background, and you can change that as well. So right now the default is, like before, white with a 0% opacity. But if I change this opacity, say to 50%, you'll see it's now gotten lighter in the inside of the grid of the diagram. And similarly, I can change the color here to something else, maybe olive. So I now have 50% olive, 50% opacity, olive background within the grid. And obviously, if I set this to 100, it'll completely override any green coming through. You'll get the completely olive color coming through. All right, slave. I know this diagram is looking uglier and uglier as we go along, but the power of Chordious is to let you change and tweak any element of the diagram, and it's up to you to pick a style that works for you. The default styles are there because I found that to be a clean and simple style, but the point of Chordious isn't to make diagrams exactly how I want them to look, but to give you the power to make diagrams that look exactly how you want them to look. So next we're going to go to grid lines. So again, we have a color and we have thickness. So first of all, let me change the thickness here. I can change the thickness to 6, and you'll see all the lines got thicker on the grid. And you can see color is black, but obviously I can change that. If I wanted them to be white, now they're white. So just like any of the other colors, I can pick here from the list, or I can type in my own hexadecimal color values. Okay, the next options we have here is around the grid nut. Now you can see by default, or at least in this diagram, it's already been checked. We already have a nut visible because this diagram was created with the chord finder, and since it's a G major chord here that's up here, or at the right up here up against the nut on the actual instrument, the chord finder went ahead and added the nut to the diagram. But the nut is optional, and so if I wanted to, I could uncheck the nut, and you'll see the nut being represented by a thicker top line here on the grid. So I can go ahead and turn that on or off. And you'll see that even if it's on here, the default, of course, is off, because by default, a diagram doesn't need to have a nut on it. So you only add the nut typically in diagrams where you're up at the bottom of the fretboard here, all the way up against the nut. So I'm going to go ahead and put it back. I want it there. But you also can change here. The ratio is how thick the nut is. So by default, it's twice as thick as a regular grid line. But you can change that ratio here. So if I did 400%, you'll see now it's much thicker than it was before. But I'm going to go ahead and leave that at 200% because I think that looks just fine. Okay, so that's everything here on the left-hand side. Now let's go over to the right-hand side of the editor and see what else we can change. The first easiest one right up here is the title. And it's just a text box. We have G here, but we can type whatever we want in here. Type that in there. That becomes the text in the title. So, pretty straightforward. Next we have the title text. This is all of the information about the text up here, the style of this G, this title up on top. So you can see the default. We have a serif font, regular style, 38 point. It's black at 100% opacity. The label style, the modify ratio. We'll get to that in a second. So if I want to change the font, check the box here. And now you'll see all the fonts that are available on my system. So if I wanted to, I could say, let's see, Trebuchet MS. And you'll see now I've changed the font right here. So you can see I have access to all the fonts that are on the system. The defaults are there. Serif is kind of a generic thing that will work on all computers, but you can put this here. So you pick the font. Style lets you change. Right here, we can change if we want it to be bold, or italic, or bold and italic. Right? You can pick the style there. I'm going to leave it regular for now. Go ahead and check that. Here's it's at 38 point, but I can make that larger if I wanted to. I could do 48 point. And now you can see it's bigger. Or I can make it even smaller if I wanted to. So you can change the size there. I'm going to leave it at the default. Color, again, just like everywhere else, change the color of the title and its opacity. So we could do this, and we do 50% opacity, and if that's what you wanted, but I'm leaving it the way it is. This next thing, label style. So there's two different label styles. We have regular and chord name. So if you look here, there's an example. If I put two capital G's, you'll notice that this second G is smaller. So by default, when you create a diagram using the chord finder, it sets the style to chord name, which makes the second, any following, everything after the root note becomes smaller. So if I put it to regular, then we just have regular, that's the default. The default is all the text up here in the title is the same size, and uses the same label style. But if I go here and I put it back to chord name, then you'll see we have this modifier ratio. So if I click the modifier ratio, right now you'll see that the following letters or the following characters after the root note, or after the first letter of the root note, are 75%. But you could change that. You can make it 50% if you wanted to make them even smaller. So this is the example of if you wanted to have, if this was a G7 chord, let's say, and you wanted that little 7 as opposed to a full size 7, you could do that here. Obviously, if I turn back to regular, then they're going to be the same size. So again, up to you how you want your diagrams to look, but this is how you control the size of those following things. And so even if you did something like this, this ratio applies to all the letters after the first. So G diminished 7, so you can see how much smaller that is compared to everything else. Okay? Or even perhaps more accurately for this diagram, you wanted to have it, your G major like that. Okay? The next here section is the title layout. So obviously the title is visible. We could check this box and uncheck it and hide the title if we wanted to. And you can see now that it's gone, the image is resized because it doesn't need to take that space. So that you can just turn the title off if you wanted to. The next thing we have is alignment. Obviously the default here is aligned in the center. If I check this, I can go left or right. It's a little hard to tell. Let's see. To make it easier to tell that that's changing, let's go over here to our string spacing. Uncheck that, so we're back to the default string spacing, which is a little wider. Let me change that back to just a G. Okay, so now if we go to alignment and do left and right, you'll see that more obviously that it's aligning to the left or right of the diagram. So the default is center. I'm going to leave it as center, so I'm going to uncheck this. I don't want to override it. And I want to uncheck this. Yeah, because I don't want to override it. And then we have grid padding. So this is the padding between the bottom of the title and the grid. So the default here is 20, but if for some reason you're like, oh, that's too close, I need to make it a little bit farther away, you can do that, and it adds a little more padding. Okay? All right. The next set of styles here apply to the marks. Now we have, this diagram has 4 marks on it, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 right here. Actually, it has 8 marks because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and technically we have 5, 6, 7, and 8. These are all marks down here. They're just off of the fretboard. So, all of these styles have to do with changing the styles of the marks as they appear. Just like the diagram as a whole inherits some default styles, we have some default mark styles that these are following. Now, perhaps it'll be a little bit easier before we get into changing them for all. If we change it for all the diagram, we can do this. So we want to change the normal marks. So you can see we have different types of marks that are on here, right? We have normal marks, which would be these marks here. We have root marks. So this is a root mark because that was the root note in the chord diagram. This happens to be a root one, and you can see it has a slightly different style. It's a diamond instead of a circle. We have open and open root. Well, those would be, if we have those represent the styles of any marks that are up here at the top. So we can have, what the open style looks like and what the open root a root node in the open style looks like. We have muted, which controls the style of muted marks for strings that you're not playing. And then bottom represents the marks that are down here underneath the diagram. So let's say for normal, I want to go through, so we have mark background. Again, just like all of the other options, we can do visibility. If I uncheck that, you'll see all the marks disappeared. Because default, every mark style inherits from normal. So we're going to set that back to the way it was, because we do actually want to see all the marks here on the diagram. We have the basic shape. So the default shape is a circle for all diagrams, for all marks on a diagram. So I can go here and I can change the shape. We could do square. We could do diamond. Do X's. Or we could have no shape at all. But let's say I keep it on circle. As you can see, the shapes of these marks didn't change. And that's because this is not just a normal mark, it's a root mark, and these are not just a normal mark, these are bottom marks. And we'll see that they've already overridden that default style. So even though the default style is circle, the bottom mark, the default style, is to have no mark in the background. So I can change the circle here. Obviously, I can change the color. I can change the opacity. Make them, we'll try it again. Right, make them slightly transparent if I wanted to. And then the radius ratio, so that's basically that's how you control the size. So right now they're set to be 2/3 of the space, the height and width, right, whichever is smaller. So here we have the height here, so this only takes up, the smaller part is the width, right, between the fret spacing and the string spacing. The string spacing is smaller, so it's going to be 2/3 of that. So here you can just change this ratio. If I did 100%, you'll see if you had marks right next to each other, they would be exactly touching. And obviously, if you go higher than 100%, then it's going to give me an error because 100% would make them touching, and anything bigger than that, and then the marks would override one another. So I do that here. I could also make it as small as 33%. That makes them a lot tinier, and you see everything becomes a lot smaller. But 2/3 is a good compromise I found. And the nice thing is, even as you're changing all of the other sizes, leaving that at the 2/3, the marks will resize accordingly automatically. We have borders down here. So the style set to normal, we can set the border to black. There's no thickness, but let's say if I give it a thickness of 5, you'll see I've now added a thick border around all of the diagrams. All of the marks. So I can do something, I think purple, let's say, right? So I can change the mark border. And then we have things around the mark text. So obviously the text is visible, and the text alignment is centered. Font. So just like with just all the same options that you have with the title, you can do for the individual mark text. Now, as you can see, the only marks that have text are these bottom marks down here. But if I change the text size ratio, for example, I could make it 100%. And that will make that's how you control the size of the text within the marks. So each of these individual marks down here have their own text size ratio. Okay, and the text opacity, obviously I can make it lighter. Oh, nope, 500 is too big. 50. There we go, so it makes them slightly transparent. And you can change the text color and everything else just like you could what you'll see here is that it didn't override the text on here. So I'm going to go ahead and uncheck these. And check all, so all these options are for changing all of the text, but really more often than not, you're going to want to change an individual mark. So how do we change this individual mark? Like, this mark is not what I want it to be. Well, the next thing you can do, if you right-click on the preview on a mark, you'll see we have a bunch of different options. Obviously, we have our options to copy these images to the clipboard if we wanted to, but we have edit mark and remove mark. So if we want to start editing an individual mark, we could do edit mark here, and this will bring up the mark editor. As you can see, it has all the same options, the exact same options that are available here in the right side of the diagram editor, you have here in the diagram mark editor. And you can see this is what, but this is all constrained to this particular type, this particular mark that we clicked on. So if I added text to it, let's say, put a D here, I hit OK. Now you'll see I've added a D to that particular mark. So if you want to edit an individual mark, right click and hit edit, or you can just try double clicking on it to bring up the mark editor. So now I can change all the properties of that individual mark. And as you can see, the only thing it has is a normal type mark and a D. Right? But if I wanted to, I could say change the text color. It's default to white because obviously the mark itself is black, so you want to have white text to see the contrast. But I could say change that to green. If I hit OK, now we have a green on the D. So just double click on it, and we can see other things we can change about it. So if I wanted to, I could change the shape of it. So even though it's a normal shape, I could decide that this one needs to be a square for whatever reason. And now we have a square mark there. Edit it. What else could we change? So any of the options here we can change just for this specific mark. Right here, I can make it bold if I wanted to. I can give it its own border, whatever I want. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and reset this back to the way it was. If I hit this reset button here, what that's going to do is it's going to take away all the overrides. So all these check boxes, it's basically going to uncheck all these boxes for me. So if I hit that, I do yes. Oh. And it'll set everything back to the way it was. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the text from it. Okay. So you can see you can right click on any of the marks. You can edit the marks down here. If I edit this mark, you'll see it shows up as a bottom type mark. If I wanted to, I could change it. I hit OK. And now it's going to be styled like a normal mark, which is a black circle with white text on it. Let me change that back. So that's a quick way if you don't want it to look different, you can change it, the type up here. Change it back to bottom. Okay. All right. As you saw before, if I right click on any of these marks, you'll see I have a remove mark. So I can go ahead and hit remove mark here. And there we go. I've removed that mark from the diagram. Remember, once Chordious has a diagram, it's just a collection of marks on a fretboard. It doesn't remember that this is a G chord from ukulele. So now I can change this to be exactly what I wanted to. If I wanted to, another way I could have done this diagram is I could have gone up here. If I right click, I can do add mark. So let's say I'm up here, I want to add an open mark, right? And hit OK. And now I've added an open mark, which is also a G chord, but I've decided I want to have an open mark up here rather than the one that I had down there. Now, of course, you'll see that this diagram has a problem in that we have a bar here that doesn't make sense. Right? We have this curved bar line saying a bar across here, but if obviously we want this note open, then we don't want that bar mark to be there. So we're going to skip down, And you can see at the very bottom here on the right-hand side, we have bar style. And these are all the things that let you control control how bars look in general. And then we have, of course, the individual bar itself. So if I right-click here, you'll see there's an edit bar option. In fact, if I just double-click on it, there we go. I can bring up the bar editor. So you can see here are all the different options that I can set on the diagram bar. And it has a default as an arc ratio of 50%. So if I do that, you'll see, if I set it to 100 and hit OK, you'll see it gave a slight higher curve. If you want a straight line, you could do 0% to have a straight line mark. And at this bar, you have other options. You have the opacity. You can change the color of it. You can change the thickness. If I wanted a really big, thick line, I could have, do that there to make it a much thicker line. Obviously, the visibility, so we have alignment. So by default, the alignment is top-down alignment. So if I do alignment middle, I could do top instead, and it puts it up directly over the fret line there. Edit bar. We can do bottom, obviously it puts it down there. And you can see if we set the other thing we can change is the stack. So let me switch back to middle. The default is it's underneath the marks. So if I were to, for example, let's edit that mark just to show that if I change its color to gray, let's say, you can see that the bar goes underneath. You can change that if you edit the bar here and do the stack. We have undermark and overmark. So I do overmark and hit OK. Now you'll see that the bar line goes on top of the mark. So you can change how you want the bars to look. So I'm going to set these back to the original things. Now, of course, as I said, like we put this mark up here, and it doesn't make sense to have a bar on the diagram anymore. The other thing you can do, obviously, is just remove the bar. But let's say I've done all of that, and I want to go ahead and add that bar back, and I want to get rid of this mark. So I can go up here, I can remove the mark, let it resize, and then I can right-click on this fret, or in between these frets here, and I can do add bar. It's going to ask me how many strings. So I started it right here. So let me try that again. I'm starting it right here. I do add bar. And it's bar across how many strings? 2. If I do OK, it brings up this to let me change the style, but I go ahead and hit OK. And you can see it's only going across 2 here. If I want, so that way you can do partial bars if you want. For example, if I clicked over here and did add bar, it'll go across 3. So the minimum, of course, is 2. But if I do that, now you'll see it goes across the 3. So depending on where you right-click, you can change the length. So I do add bar, and I do 4, and hit OK, and hit OK. Now I have a bar that goes all the way across again. Also, obviously, if I remove this bar and I do add bar again, I could just do 2, for example, and then hit OK. And now I can do 2 if I want to have a bar on the left-hand side. Okay. So go ahead, remove this bar here, add a bar across all 4 strings. There we go. And as I said before, all the styles for all the bars here, so if I wanted to, if I had multiple bars, which doesn't necessarily make sense, but if you wanted to do it, you can do it. And then you control all of their styles and set the default here if you wanted. So you could do stack over marks, and you'll see that it's not going over the mark. We could change the ratio of them. We can make them both always flat. We could change the thickness. We could change the color of them together. Let's make it stand out. Fuchsia. Okay, so that's the bars. The last thing we have is something that doesn't exist in this diagram, which are fret labels. So, separate from the marks, separate from the bars, are also fret labels that you can add on the sides of your diagram. If you right-click on the side here, you'll see, just add mark. Here we go. So a little bit farther away from the diagram, you can do add fret label. And I'm going to add some text. Usually this is where you'll put the fret number, but you don't have to. So let me go ahead and do 1 just to show. All right, there's a 1 right there as a fret label. You can also put fret labels on the other side. Hit OK. And just like the marks, you can double click on them to bring up the fret label editor. You can edit the text. And again, a lot of these, you should be able to get a handle of what all these things do. We have the font. You can change the style if you want to be bold or italic. You can change the color, the opacity. You can change the size ratio. So by default, they're the same size as marks, which is 2/3 the height here. And there's also a width ratio. So you can tweak this as well. If I hit OK here, see I give a little more side padding there. Undo that. We also have alignment. So if I do alignment right, hit OK, you'll see. That's kind of hard to see. Let's see, edit fret label. Well, here, we're going to do this. We're going to leave that there. We're going to add a fret label down here. That's 5. And its width ratio is going to be, nope, it's too big. All right. So let's say we have a bunch of text down here. You don't have to put a number, you can put whatever you want. With fret. Okay. So we can have a label down here. We have this label here. You can see they're both centered. Now if I edit this fret label, it'll be easier to tell. If I do left, it aligns it to the left. Or I can align it to the right. Right, and then also we have grid padding, which is the padding between the fret label and the diagram itself. So I can go ahead and make that larger if I wanted to. It's still right aligned, but now I have 50 pixels of padding right here. So again, this is just a bunch of different ways that you can tweak how your how the diagram looks. So I'm going to remove these here. You can change the visibility of it. I'm just going to go ahead and hit OK. And then, of course, you can always remove fret labels that you don't want anymore. I'm going to remove that fret label too. And down here, you'll see the global options if you have multiple fret labels here. Hit OK. We can change everything at once. So I can do, say, 50 for the label layout, the padding, and you'll see that it spaces out and gives me 50 pixels of padding. So if you want to change it for all the fret labels at once, you can do it right here. Same thing with color and style and everything else. You can change them here. Change the maroon, change the font to something else. Make them bold if I wanted to. So if you want to override all of the styles of the fret labels, you can modify them right here. So in summary, we've got marks, We have marks down here. We can have marks up here. We have fret labels, which are over here on the sides. And we have bars. If you want to change the style of all of them at once, you have all these options down here. You have the mark styles, the fret label styles, and the bar style. And if you want to change an individual mark or an individual bar or an individual fret label, you can go ahead and double click on any of the individual elements in the preview and change that specific element. Okay, so we have a pretty atrocious looking diagram here. Obviously, if I hit cancel, it will not keep any of the changes that I've made. So that's one way we could go about it, undoing all this. But let's say I hit OK, and now it's saved in my diagram library, this ugly version of the diagram. Well, let's say I wanted to change it and get it back to the default style. The easiest thing to do is, again, open it back up in the editor. And you'll see we have this little reset button down here. Now, what this does is this is the equivalent of going through and unchecking everything. So if you've added marks or if you've added bars or fret labels, those are all going to stay, but it will reset just the style of everything. So if you see here, if I go ahead and click reset, I want to continue, yes. Everything went back to the original style, the default Chordious built-in style. In fact, if you remember, this diagram specified that there was a nut. Well, the default style doesn't have a nut for a default diagram, so if I wanted to put that nut back, I have to remember to go in here, hit visible, and check the box to the top of this, because this happens to be a chord diagram, and not just a generic, or it happens to be at the top of the up near the nut on the actual fretboard. So I want to show the nut there, so I'm going to put that back. But you can see it still has the extra bar in there, and it still has these fret labels. So if I wanted to completely go back to the way it was, I'd have to actually remove each of these fret labels. If I remove those, you'll see the padding gets fixed. Then I can go ahead and remove this bar here. Now we get back to the way the diagram was when we first started. I can go ahead and hit OK. And save it. So that's it. That's basically all of the options. I know there's a lot of different things you can change, and it can feel overwhelming, but it's all here. And so if you find that there's just something slightly wrong about your diagram, or just one little thing that you want to tweak, you can probably find it here in the diagram editor. So, I hope this was helpful. Thank you for watching.